Okay, I wasn't going to do it, but it kind of has to be done now that we're here. So here's just one major deviation, and then we'll get back to the poem that we're looking at. Jupiter is the Latin for Zeus or Zeus. And Jupiter, the planet, is the oldest planet in the solar system. I think that's important. Now, bear in mind, what I may be telling you is, you could say it's allegedly, or the official story, or what is said to be the true narrative. But, this is just, it's always useful to examine what we are told is true. So, for example, if they tell us that Jupiter is 90% hydrogen and 10% helium, well, let's just not dismiss it immediately. Let's just examine it and see what we can learn. At least within, I think it's always useful to examine things within their own bookends, within their own canon, as it were. Now, Jupiter, I did look this up to refresh my memory, or not just refresh my memory, to perhaps get it clear in my mind what it is that I think I know. And I noticed it has an unusual symbol. To me, the symbol of Jupiter looks like a stylized number or numeral 4. I was going to say the letter 4. Or, because it's not fully closed, it almost looks like a 2 and a 1 then going through it, which to me might symbolize the hydrogen and the helium. Hydrogen is the first element and helium is the second element. Under intense heat, 2 hydrogen atoms can be fused together to form a helium. So that idea can be translated into something else, which I'll get into momentarily, that 2 can become 1 in that sense, or they can be variations of the same thing. So let me explore the idea of Jupiter as being a Roman god, if Zeus or Zeus is God in the Greek language. So Jupiter, if I just kind of split that, just take the first 2 letters, J-U, and I pronounce it as Ju or Ju, and then Piter, I have Dieu in the French language, which means God, if I kind of pronounce it. The J like a D-I, Dieu, and the U like an EU, Dieu. And then Piter, if I just swap the I for an E, it's Peter, who is the rock upon which the church is founded. And Peter comes from pater, which is P-A-T-E-R, and it's the Latin for father. So we have Dieu, which is French for God, and then we have pater, which is Latin for father. So we have the God Father, or God the Father. So I don't think that's much of a stretch. In fact, I think, although there may be some language experts who might say, but you can't just combine French and Latin in your etymology, it must be all from the one language. I would say that there aren't such defined borders around languages. I'm taking a slight poetic license here, but I think, for example, like that we know that in English so many words are from French, and there's historical reasons for that, and so many words are from, Angles or Saxon. There are lots of words you can bring from one language to another, and there'll be other reasons for it too. Maybe French itself being a lingua franca. But let me move on. So we have God the Father. Now, another word for Jupiter is Jove. Why would there be another word for it? Well, I hope that maybe the reason for that will occur to you as it occurred to me. So if Jove is another name for Jupiter, why would we need another name for this Roman god? Why would this Roman god have 2 names? I wonder if people beginning to see it yet if you translate the Roman gods into Christianity. Now, as recently as the early 20th century, if you can imagine British gentlemen walking around with their walking canes and their bowler hats, if they became surprised by something, they would exclaim, "By Jove! By Jove!" And they might even say, "Gadzooks," but by Jove as well. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means by God. But I am postulating that it's the direct equivalent of when people consider this to be blasphemous or taking the Lord's name in vain. Well, I don't consider it to be taking the Lord's name in vain. I think that that's an entirely different thing, which means presuming the glory of God or Jesus to be your own, that you are speaking in his name and saying, I have a direct channel to God, he says this, so I'm telling you to do this. That's what is using his name in vain, I would say. So I'm saying that in case people get offended by just saying the words, oh Jesus, if you get afraid about something, or if you're surprised, or if you're frightened, and you just exclaim that. It's probably not ideal to do it. Maybe train yourself not to have automatic vocal reactions, reflex reactions. But it's just, I'm saying that's a thing that people do. So for whatever reason, as recently as the early 20th century, in other words, the 1900s, or perhaps even after World War I, people were still saying, by Jove. I'm saying that's the direct equivalent of modern day people, us in the modern age, saying, oh Jesus. And here's my reasoning for that. Jove is Jove. Now you can swap a J for a Y or an I. They're pretty much all the same letters. And so you would have, the ability maybe to pronounce it in a way that you would get to Jove or Yehov or Jehovah or Jehovah, which I think a lot of people would agree is the equivalent of Jesus, or at least he may have been addressed in that manner. If it was in a Hebrew type of language. Jehovah might even mean Saviour or something like that. Or, the special one or the anointed one. So what I'm suggesting there again, just to refer back to this interesting symbol, which may be a 2 and a 1 together. And the 2 may be, again, to call something else in the Ledean swans, may be swan-shaped. When we were little children, we were told to write our letters and our numbers, and learning how to write these things, they'd say the 2 is just like a swan. So I'm suggesting that the 2 and the 1 are combined in such a way to combine the idea of God the Father and Jesus. So they're the same thing, but they're not quite. Now also I will say that why are they not quite? Because maybe God the Father is the older, elder, more distant Father, and maybe Jesus is the friendlier, nearer, I suppose, more directly on earth type of loving person. Jovial as an adjective means somebody who's more friendly, kinder, his spirit is more gentle and loving and friendly. So perhaps you could say as well that the same thing but from a different perspective, or through a different lens, or maybe even at a different time. But the gods, it doesn't really matter what they are called, they are immortal and they're for time immemorial. So whoever's looking at them through the lens of their own time or their own culture might see these things differently or call them different things. So I'll just briefly mention that to invoke the idea of Jesus as well, we have Galileo Galilei, and he's, as far as the official story and narrative tells us anyway, he was heavily not just criticised but sanctioned by the Catholic Church because he was contradicting the idea at the time that generally the sun and the moon and everything revolved around the earth, and he was saying, I think maybe it's not, because I've discovered some things that are orbiting something in the heavens. And he was saying that he noticed 4 moons of Jupiter, and they were orbiting Jupiter. So this was the first time anything was orbiting something that wasn't the Earth. And people don't like change, and they don't like, the apple cart being upset. And the Catholic Church didn't like this, I suppose I'm going to say, because obviously it was a threat to their power, because if somebody said, well, if they're wrong about this, what else might they be wrong about? Now, Jupiter may have 100 moons, more than 80. I think the official count at the moment is 79. But the biggest moons are Ganymede, Io, Europa, and Callista. And if anybody is interested, we could do a deep dive on those. But they were also consorts of Jupiter. So maybe it's unknown how many consorts Jupiter had. And this is why it's unknown how many moons are orbiting Jupiter now, They might not have been enthralled with his great presence in the beginning, but they are orbiters now of this big presence in the heavens. And I think it would be interesting for a lot of people at the moment to look at Europa in greater detail. But these moons are called the Galilean moons after Galileo Galilei. And Galilei is the genitive case in Latin, which means of Galilee. Genitive is possessive. And so his family, according to his surname, which he kind of only really adopted in the 1600s, means of Galilee, which is a region in a place in the Mediterranean, of the East Mediterranean, which I would rather not even say, south of Lebanon. But I think there's a part of it, that this region that is in modern day Lebanon, and there's the Sea of Galilee and things like that. So that invokes again Jesus's, or the idea of Jesus, or his life anyway. And so maybe I'll just end this deviation into a sort of a sub-idea by saying that a priest said in a sermon, which was critical of Galileo, he said, "Why must ye men of Galilee stand gazing up at the heavens?" He was sort of saying, stop looking for things to contradict us about. So I think that's fascinating. And that quote is from the Bible, Acts. I can't remember what it is, maybe book 1, chapter 11, something like that. I'll put it on screen. So a lot of people might even say, oh, so that's a bit of a foreshadowing of what Galileo would do later. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on, again, how you look at it, what lens you look at it through. And fascinating, I think, as well, like that, the Medicis and maybe even the Borgias, if I'm interpreting their name right, were people who educated him and sponsored him and were his financial backers, the Medicis. So a very important family. So all of that could send you down a spider web. I've gone perhaps more into it than I should have, as just a little deviation. But if anybody's interested to look into these things more, then that would motivate me to look into them and connect several aspects of the big spider web. But for now, let's get back onto just Zeus and Leda and this poem again by W.B. Yeats.